Hello and welcome to today's session. Thank you for joining us for an interesting discussion about cultural intelligence and teams. A few housekeeping items before we begin. You'll note that all participants are muted with cameras off. However, there is chat functionality in Zoom, and we encourage you to utilize that throughout our discussion today. Feel free to comment and ask questions, and note that we will save 10 to 15 minutes at the end of today's webinar for questions from the audience. For those individuals who were unable to attend today, we will be sharing a recording of the session. I'd like to take this moment to introduce our session administrator, Ms. Prudence Anglam. Prudence will help us keep the session running smoothly today. If you have any questions, concerns, or technical challenges, please reach out to Prudence. And note that her name will include session administrator in the title. One final item, before we end today's session, I will be announcing the winner of the Culturally Intelligent Teams Workshop. Great, so Prudence, go ahead and take down the slide. I'm going to introduce our panelists today, Mr. Andre Uriga. Andre is a CQ Associate Facilitator and the Managing Director of his own consultancy, Culture Bridge, in Slovakia. Andre has extensive experience managing and consulting diverse and multicultural teams. He's spent much of his early career in corporate sales and human resources, and now focuses on consulting teams and the leaders of those teams to become more innovative, inclusive, and effective. With that, Andre, let's go ahead and get into our first question of today. Given your extensive background in this area of teams and leadership, what would you say is the number one challenge that leaders are facing with their teams today?
Well, first of all, Keela, thank you very much for having me today, and good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to all of you, depending on where you are connecting from. It's late evening indeed for me here in Slovakia, which is my home country. So good to see all of you here in the webinar. And so, Keela, if you ask me, I would probably start telling you what the leaders and the teams are telling me, that this is the challenge number one they see. And so what I hear them very often are two major challenges that they keep talking about. Challenge number one is, I consider it kind of an evergreen challenge, if you want, because I hear that again and again, and it has been the case for many years. And so that's being overloaded. So team members complaining about having simply too much on their plate. And I remember that has been the case for myself when I was working in corporate settings many years ago. There was this constant pressure on doing more with less. Right. And so that's challenge number one I hear teams and leaders talking about. Challenge number two that I hear them speaking about is relatively recent for many teams, and it is connected to the COVID pandemics, although I have to say that this challenge has been here for much longer period of time as well. And that's the remote or virtual team collaboration. And when I say that it has been here for many years before pandemics, I'm using myself as an example, because almost 20 years ago, I used to work in an organization where I was leading a sales department of almost 100 professionals located in 3 different locations, 3 different countries with 3 different languages. And so the only way we could really collaborate as a team was virtually. And I was based in Slovakia, being responsible for the sales market in Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. And as a sales leader for this part of Europe, I was part of or member of what we called Europe, Middle East, and Africa sales leadership team. So on daily basis, I had to collaborate with my counterparts from India, from Morocco, all over Europe. Our global leader was located in the United States. And so we really had to address those challenges of virtual or remote team collaboration. But I do acknowledge that many teams are going through this challenge now only as an impact or consequence of the recent pandemic. So the reason I'm telling you this is just to send the message to all our participants who might be going through similar challenge, that there is a great wealth of knowledge and experience about how to address these challenges. But if you ask me, Keela, what I see as the challenge number one, as an external observer and consultant of those teams and leaders, then I would say that it's the inability to see our team members, our people, as the main asset or as the main way of achieving our business objectives. What do I mean by that? More often than not, what I see happening is that we try to achieve business goals, business strategies, our KPIs through tools, through applications, through systems. And we kind of forget that there are real people behind those tools, system, and so on. But when, for example, we realize as a team that we are not meeting the business goals or business objectives, what we do, we try to fix the tool. We try to improve the system to make it better, more flexible, so we can meet those objectives. But it's rather rare when I see a team sitting down, pausing, and talking about what's going on in terms of team dynamics. Why is it that us as a team are not able to use those tools that are available to us to achieve our business objectives? Why is it that we are not getting along well with each other? Why is it that we communicate differently? Why is it that we have these interpersonal tensions and miscommunications? I remember recently I had a conversation with a few participants in one of my workshops, and we were talking about the emotion of frustration, which is one of those emotions people very often feel when they work in diverse settings. And one of them said, I don't feel frustrated by my manager. I don't feel frustrated by my clients or by my peers. I feel frustrated only by situations. And that made me realize once again that we kind of have the tendency to depersonalize or dehumanize the work that we do. We talk about kind of abstract systems that we use to achieve goals, but again, there are real people with real faces, real names behind those tools. So I would say it is this depersonalization or dehumanizing aspect of the work that we do that I do see as a challenge, real big challenge. And then as a consequence of such approach is that when it comes to talent development, very often we would send our team members to attend workshops and trainings with the expectation, with the hope that they will get equipped with new tools, with new methods, systems, frameworks, rather than sending them to those development programs where they can grow as individuals, where they can experience personal growth, understanding who they are, what makes them tick, and what makes them explode.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I can imagine, especially today, where there are topics that are uncomfortable for some to discuss if they don't feel equipped or prepared to have those conversations. It might be easier or less uncomfortable to default to a system or a policy problem. That's very interesting insight, Andre. Thank you. When you are talking with teams and leaders about this challenge, this idea that we often forget people are our greatest asset on our teams, and we overlook setting that foundation of common understanding. What is it that you help leaders and teams do? How can they build common values on their teams?
That's a great question, Keela. And so, every year I'm facilitating a few what I call project-based talent development programs. So what we do with the clients is that we put together a team of professionals, colleagues from the same company, but they don't know each other, or maybe they know each other, but they don't necessarily collaborate with each other as peers on daily basis, right? So we create a team, a newly existing team, and then we assign them a task or a project, which is a real business challenge that the company is going through. So for example, this client would deal with certain business challenges that are real, that are not hypothetical, and they would ask these high potential employees from within the organization to spend some time during the talent development program on addressing that business challenge. Or another client would ask this team to develop new solution for clients, new product, new service. And so this newly created team typically has certain amount or period of time, let's say 6 months, to not only identify the solution for the challenge, for the problem, but also to test it and evaluate the impact of that solution, and eventually present the results in front of the leadership team. So you have this group of strangers who don't know each other. They know nothing about each other. They have only those 6 months or even less to come up with real tangible solution, right? So typically we have a series of workshops that are supposed to help those talents to grow, because after all, this is talent development program. But what I do during the very first workshop always is we don't talk about the project at all at the beginning. We don't talk about the task. We don't talk about how we are going to solve the challenge or address the challenge. We spend the whole time during the first initial workshops on talking about who we are, because we don't know each other. We are a newly created team. So we really spend a lot of time understanding what are our individual values, what are our triggers, what makes me triggered, what makes me respond emotional, which kind of behavior do I find frustrating or irritating, right? What are some of my preferences in behavior, such as, I don't know, communication? How do I prefer to bring my messages through? Am I this very straightforward communicator, or do I like to use rather nuanced communication style where I expect the others to go under the surface of my message? How do I express disagreement, right? So do I like to be confrontational and say it as it is, being very straightforward with my disagreement, or do I take into consideration how the feedback receiver is feeling about my message? What is my understanding of leadership? How do I like to be led? Do I need to get or receive guidance and direction, or do I like to be independent in my decisions, right? So we really spend a lot of time talking about these, what we call cultural values, right? And then we ask people in this workshop, in this newly created team, to really map themselves against some of these cultural values. And I know, Keela, that you have a picture ready for us that kind of manifests or visualize what I'm talking about here. So this is an example of the activity that I would do in the very first workshop, right? So first explaining these cultural values, these dimensions, really talking in depth about how they manifest in specific situations, so every team member can decide what would be their preference. And then once we go through this, the participants would place themselves along these scales. It would look similarly to this. Thank you for manifesting this, Keela. So I'm doing it either virtually or even in physical settings. And so when we receive this kind of outcome from this activity, we start to have a reflection with the team members. So what could this potential mean? So wherever you see some similarities, do you think, or do you consider that homogeneity in this team as an asset, as an added value, or can you imagine that this similarity can actually represent an obstacle or a challenge? And if you see that you as a team are spread all across the scale, what will you do to bridge those differences in the team, right? So first we reflect on what this could mean for the team dynamics. And then once we have that conversation, we go into the motivation. Why should we do something with this? So instead of jumping right away into some strategies, what to do with this kind of outcome, we rather spend time talking about why should we invest time and an effort talking about these things? What is the desired outcome we would like to get out of such an effort? And only then, when we are clear on the motivation, on the why, then we start identifying or exploring the strategies, how to build a new team culture. And the reason why we do all these activities in the very first workshop is because as a newly created team, we need to lay very strong foundation for the future short-term collaboration, because we have only those 6 months to achieve our objective. And so if we don't spend the time at the beginning of the process to lay the foundation and define the team dynamics, the team culture, then we would probably deal with a lot of misunderstandings throughout the whole process. So instead of doing this, we save the time for the project itself and invest this time at the beginning of the talent development program.
Yeah, that's really powerful. And you can see with the visual, there's already members of the audience communicating on, how much sense that makes to start a project by understanding those individuals that we're working on the project with. I'm curious, Andre, of the different values that I had pulled up on screen, we could see from that visual that there's several polarized different values that we could talk about. Out of the 10 that we showed, are there any that you see show up more often than others in terms of those values that might cause some frustration between participants or members of a project team?
That's an interesting question, Keela. I do agree with you that sometimes there is a tendency in teams to limit their conversation on 2 or 3 of those dimensions. So, for example, they would look into communication, direct versus indirect. Sometimes it's called also low or high context communication style. So they would look into this because we all communicate, right? Then they would look into leadership. What is our understanding of the leadership role? Is it low power distance or high power distance? And eventually they would look into the category of time. How do team members perceive time and deadlines? But I have the tendency to advise the teams to look into the whole portfolio of these cultural values. And I mean, we are talking about 10 here, right? But there are even more values. So I think it's important to look into the other values as well, because they are very often the answer to what is going on in a team. So let me give you a specific example. For example, emotional expressiveness. Sometimes this is one of those cultural dimensions or cultural values that are being undervalued, meaning like, oh, no, like being emotional or non-emotional, I don't think this plays a role, but actually it can play a huge role in the way we interact with each other. And a few days ago, I was having a coaching session with one of my clients, and she just joined a new team. And so as usual, I was talking with her about who she is in terms of these values and who is the team, the new team. And then when I asked her, do you see any potential challenges in this new team? She said, yes, there is one team member, and I can already tell you that my collaboration with her will be really challenging. And I said, okay, why is that? And she said, because she has this constant poker face and she doesn't even blink her eyes. And I think, now I'm quoting my client, she said, I think that people who don't blink their eyes, they are hiding something because they're putting so much effort into not showing and hiding the emotions that for sure they have some secret to hide. And I was like, oh, this is very interesting. And all of a sudden we had this conversation about this cultural dimension or cultural value called emotional expressiveness or non-expressiveness, explaining her that yeah, sure, this could be one interpretation why she's not blinking her eyes and not showing her emotions. But another reason could be that she grew up in a culture when manifesting emotion is not appropriate. It's perceived as lack of maturity, lack of professionalism, or the reason that she's not blinking her eyes as frequent as my client would expect could be simply of physiological nature. right? So all of a sudden, we moved from one single interpretation to a whole range of interpretations, which help her to shift mentally and realize and acknowledge, I made a judgment, I made an assumption, but I probably need to verify. I probably need to understand these dynamics much deeper, right? Um, Individualism, collectivism, another of those dimensions or cultural values where people tend to believe that, oh, we don't need to look into this. But we actually do, because this dimension of individualism or collectivism plays a big role in the way we present ourselves in team meetings, for example. So if I have a preference for an individualist approach, then for me it would be absolutely appropriate to sit in a team meeting and verbalize my individual opinions and say what I really think, me as an individual. But if I'm more on the collectivist side, then I wouldn't be comfortable expressing my individual views in front of the other. So imagine I'm your team member, and if you are an individualist leader, having me as a collectivist team member, and you ask me, Andre, what do you think? I wouldn't necessarily feel comfortable telling you what I think, because that would be my subjective opinion. And who am I to express my individual opinion? First, I need to get time to talk to my colleagues in my team to understand how they feel about what has been discussed. And only then I would tell you what we think. Or also in job interview, you might have a candidate who might be of collectivist preference. And then what happens very often in job interviews, candidates are being asked, so what is your major achievement? What do you consider your individual success? And they talk about what they achieved, right? So we achieved this, we accomplished that, and so on. And if the hiring manager or the talent acquisition specialist is more on the individual side, they might have the preference to push them and say, okay, but tell me, what role did you play in the whole situation, right? But for someone who is more collectivist, this might be highly uncomfortable. And then, of course, not to mention the way we motivate our team members. Individualism, collectivism plays a big role in how should we and how do we need to motivate our people. So I remember when I worked in sales many years ago, in being in sales, you evaluate your sales performance on daily basis, literally. And so our leadership team was located in the United States. And I remember they came up with the idea of creating a daily ranking of all the sales representatives. So every day we were supposed to print out the ranking and put it on the wall, so everyone could see how they scored in the previous day in terms of the performance. And it didn't work in Slovakia, where I was based, and the leadership team was wondering, why is it not working? Why are they not motivated by being the best seller in the organization? And so we had to have this conversation about this value, individualism, collectivism, where I was explaining them that people don't want to stand out of the crowd. It is not okay for them to be there as an individual. So if you really want to motivate people here in Slovakia, then let's do the team comparison, right? And so that's how we changed the whole motivation system, and it worked brilliantly. So really, there is not one single cultural value that I would call as more important than the others.
Yeah. Those are really interesting. And I can see a lot of comments coming through from the participants about how powerful a mapping exercise like this would be. Some of our participants on today's webinar have experienced it themselves if they've attended some of our trainings. And for those of you who have not, when we communicate with you after this webinar, we certainly will be providing you insights and feedbacks on the different tools and resources that are available to help facilitate this idea of understanding our people first, before our task, before our process, before our policy. Andre, I'd like to ask you, when you've worked with leaders and teams, what is it you see when there is a focus placed on people? What are those outcomes when leaders and teams focus first on building awareness of cultural values?
That's an interesting question, Kila. I think what you immediately notice is the way they look at talent development at first, right? So they would really spend time growing the team members as individuals, right? So of course, developing their hard skills and their capability to use all the available tools and so on. So I'm not saying this is not important. Absolutely, this is important, right? But it's not sufficient because once again, there are real people behind those tools and systems and so on. So uh, you see immediately that these kind of organizations who put people first, they would also focus much more on letting people grow personally at a personal level, helping them understanding who they are in terms of their psychological needs, who they are in terms of their values, as we said, and so on. So that's number one. And then you also see how people in this kind of organization spend much less time on misunderstandings because they know they know how to approach situation when those misunderstandings and misperceptions and judgments happen, right? So they are very effective in addressing those interpersonal tensions. And so being effective in addressing these people-related things save them a lot of time they can invest in focusing on the project, on the task, and so on. I remember a few weeks ago, I was in Copenhagen, in Denmark, facilitating a workshop for a group of two merging organizations, and the two most senior leaders from both sides of the organizations were in the same group, and they shared some of their practices, and they said to the rest of the team that what we practice as the senior leaders, whenever we have a one-on-one conversation, we always spend time on talking about the talk. So they have a conversation about what needs to be done and so on. And then they spend some extra time on talking about what do you actually mean by that. So they want to be sure that they did understand what each other is saying. So instead of assuming that they understand each other, they verify that they did understand each other. Now, it was really interesting to see the response from the rest of the team in the workshop. And they said, well, okay, this sounds really interesting, but you need time for that, right? And you know how busy we are as your team members. So how should we create time and space for this kind of talk about the talk? And the leader said, it's not about having extra time. It's the time you save preventing all those misunderstandings and misinterpretations of each other's intentions, right? So you save the time, and that's the time you use for having this kind of conversation. And then also, if you really put people first, what you also see as an outcome of this is stronger team cohesion. It's stronger team loyalty. So people feel more loyal because they feel that, okay, I belong here. I'm seen, I'm heard for, I can be authentic, right? So why would I leave this kind of environment where I can be myself, and through who I am, I can accomplish my business objective. So these are some of the things that you see, not to mention that people typically are willing to take extra mile if they feel this way in a team. That's what we call engagement, right?
Yeah. It is interesting that it's almost counterintuitive, this tension between we have limited time. It seems as though we should get right into our project and get started so that we can meet our deadline, when in your observation, as you consult with and grow these teams and leaders, spending the time, investing the time in your people first does save time down the line. And that's only one outcome, as you suggest. If you are more trusting of your team members, you'll share your different authentic ideas. And it's that type of collaboration that leads to more creativity, more innovation. Andre, let's move on to another question, maybe a little opposite of the prior question. What do you notice happens when leaders do not focus on building this foundation and common understanding?
Well, I think the number one, what is happening as an outcome of not putting people first is first of all, not having complete understanding of what is happening in the organization is about not having complete understanding. Why is it that we are not achieving our targets, our business objectives? It's about not having complete understanding. Why is it that we are losing clients or not acquiring new clients? Because without looking into the team cohesion and team dynamics, we really have only limited understanding of what's going on. So that's number one. And then, of course, you see teams really struggling achieving the objectives. And so instead, and I said it earlier today already, instead of really sitting down and having an honest conversation about why are we not collaborating more effectively so we can meet those objectives, instead we try to fix the systems, improve methods, and so on. I remember when I used to work in HR, on the top of my daily agenda, I was assigned to 4 very complex HR projects. And at some point, I felt tired. I felt exhausted. So I decided to share my feelings with my manager. And so her response was something that I hear very often. She said, okay, so why don't you do this analysis for me, showing me how much time do you spend on each of those tasks and projects, and then we look at it together and we identify a way how you can improve your time management and how you can become more capable of prioritizing the tasks. Back then, I wasn't fully self-aware in terms of my feelings and so on, so I simply said, yeah, let's do that. And I see that happening again and again in teams when people complain about being overloaded and so on. But being self-aware, putting people first would mean that your manager listens to you. And when they hear you saying, I feel tired, I feel exhausted, it's a strong indicator for them. Okay, exhaustion means that you are drying off your energy. There is not much energy left. So we need to change something urgently. Otherwise, this team member will experience burnout or something, right? But so this is the reason why we really need to spend time on these social skills. I don't want to call them soft skills because they are not soft at all. I call them social skills. So we really need to shift from developing these hard skills only and helping people to feel comfortable verbalizing how they feel, why they feel the way they do, and what should we do when these things happen. What should we do as we experience differences in those cultural values and so on, right? So that's what happens when you don't put people first in your organization. You don't meet your objectives. You don't understand why. Maybe you do meet your objectives with your team, but then you don't understand why team members leave the organization, why you have higher attrition, why is it that they are not loyal to the team? Well, if I don't feel that I can be authentic, that I can be myself, that I'm being included in the team, why should I stay in such a team? I will leave such a team whenever I have the first chance to leave.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And I think that, many of us are experiencing that today. It's very common for many organizations in today's market to keep the people that they have, as well as attract new individuals to their organizations. Andre, I can't help but think this question comes to my mind. I've experienced this myself. What if we're working within teams that are not interested in what they might consider to be touchy-feely topics, like how do I show up in a room? How do I feel about sharing my emotion? How can we help motivate those team members?
What a great question, Keela. Well, when I hear this kind of statement, like we don't really talk about these fluffy things, So first of all, I would like to understand what is the opposite of that. So what is the serious business for them, right? And more often than not, they will tell you, well, that's the real business that we do here. These are the projects that we are working on. The real stuff is the product that we are designing or the solution that we are developing for our client. These are the real things. This is the real business, as an opposite of this, fluffy stuff. And then I said, okay, but once again, who is behind those projects, behind those tasks, behind those deals that you are trying to close with your clients? It's your people, it's your team members. So this is about talking about people who are generating revenue in this organization. We are talking about people who are helping you to achieve your business objectives. So why wouldn't you spend time on your asset, on those who are helping you to achieve what you need to achieve, right? So that's number one. And second thing is, I work, I'm very active in the field of emotional intelligence as well, not only cultural intelligence. So I do work in the field of emotions. So when someone is telling me, no, we don't want to talk about this touchy-feely stuff, because it's too soft and so on. To me, it's an indicator that they are in denial. Now, denial is one of many emotions people have, and it's very common emotion that kicks in when people are exposed to difference. Now, every emotion, and by the way, people have access to approximately 200 distinct emotions. So each emotion is bringing you a valuable, very important information about what is happening right now for you, inside of you or outside of you, right? So the emotion of denial is telling you that you need to look away, you need to avoid confrontation with some unpleasant reality. And the reason you need to look away from that unpleasant reality is because you don't have enough knowledge, enough experience, enough skills to face that reality, right? And so when I have this kind of person telling me no to touchy-feely stuff, I need to help that person to feel or get comfortable talking about these things, because apparently they are looking away from it out of fear of being embarrassed, out of fear of not knowing how to address them, or any other reason. So the driving force behind their denial is the fear of not knowing, right? And what is the antidote to not knowing? Well, to expand your knowledge, right?
Yeah, that is interesting. And I see people are commenting and resonating with this idea of touchy-feely, fluffy, or soft skills is just not the right way to describe some of the hardest interactions that we can engage in on a daily basis. I really like your answer to that, Andre. It makes a lot of sense to me, and I'm learning from you on this webinar as well. I want to know, as our last question before we get into some questions from the audience, what advice would you share as an expert in this field with many, many years of helping leaders and teams and being part of teams and leading your own teams? What do you think would be advice that you would want to share with our folks on the webinar today?
Keela, I'm always hesitating to give advices because I think that there are so many different ways how to approach different scenarios, and that's why I don't typically do give advices. But what I would definitely mention as one way to look at this challenge that many teams are facing is that I would probably remind anyone who is leading a team that they have two responsibilities. They have the business responsibility, but at the same time, they have the people management responsibility. So spending time on your people is not something that you do on the top. It's not something that you do when the real things are completed and done. It's one of the two major management or leadership responsibilities. So you can be, of course, it is important to have a strong business acumen and technical skills, cognitive skills, and so on. It's important, but you can be the greatest strategist, you can be the greatest sales leader or any kind of leader, but if you don't know how to build an effective team and how to nurture the team, people will leave you sooner or later whenever they have a chance to leave you. So it's not enough to be strategist or a business leader. You need to be also a great and skilled team architect. But then on the other hand, it's not enough to be a great team architect, because you will succeed in creating this beautiful team environment where people feel comfortable. But if you are not a strong business leader, people also will leave, because we have this inborn need for accomplishment, for an achievement. And so if you don't create as a business leader this space for people to achieve things, to achieve objectives and goals, they wouldn't feel self-fulfilled. So one of their need is not being met. And, I very often say that I wish to see more of psychology in people development or talent development, and help people, team members and leaders, get more familiar with some of the psychological principles, because understanding human behavior is an extremely complex task, and it takes a lot of interdisciplinary approaches, right? So as a leader, you need a bit of psychology. As a leader, you need a bit of sociology, you need a bit of cultural anthropology. So it's really complex. So I wish there was much more emphasis on these aspects of leadership in terms of talent development. Because if you understand the basic principles of psychology, then you would realize that what we are discussing here today, it goes really down to two of the basic psychological needs that we all have. That's the need for being authentic. We all have it. And the need for the attachment, the need for belonging. These are two of many psychological needs every single human has. And so it is our role as leaders, as team members, to make sure that we create this space where people can be authentic in the way they prefer to do things at work, without losing their sense of belonging in this organization. So if you ask me, what is my understanding of inclusion, then I would say inclusion is not something that should be related or connected to a higher revenue, business growth, and so on. It should be really about meeting basic psychological needs of everyone in the organization, the need for being authentic and the need for belonging.
Yeah. And it's interesting how some of those needs often come in conflict with each other, right? When it's not managed well, you have this idea of assimilation where people feel, well, I have to fit in here. A question that was asked earlier by one of our participants, I'm going to pull it up here. It was, when hiring, should you look for people who have similar or different cultural values than your existing team members? And I'd like to start on this one, Andre, and then I'll pass it to you. My response to that would be, we believe in adding to culture as opposed to fitting people into culture. What do I mean by that? We understand the benefits and the outcomes of engaging effectively with individuals who think differently than we do, who approach problems differently, who come up with solutions in a different way. And if we can add those differences to our team, if we can add to, as opposed to try to fit people who have the same cultural values as we do, then we start to see some of those outcomes. If, for example, when I pulled up that cultural values map earlier, and we saw several of our team members all clustered on one side, what I would advise is look for someone who can add to what you already have. If you have a team of people who are very doing and task oriented, balance that out. Bring someone on the team who appreciates and emphasizes work-life balance so that they can start to balance the approach to work that you already have going on within your organization. How might you respond to that question, Andre? Should we look for people who have similar or different cultural values when we're hiring?
Well, I always say that it depends, so I ask the team, what is it that you are looking for? What is that is your goal, right? And so if you are homogeneous, if most of your team members are alike, how is it helping your team or the team dynamics? And can you imagine any challenge that this homogeneity might represent, right? And very often they would say, actually, this helps us to be faster as a team. It helps us to reduce the misunderstandings in the team because we are more alike. And I said, okay, so what if you have this client who is on the other side of the scale and you don't have anyone with similar mindset or with similar preference? So how do you compensate for the missing perspective in your team? How do you compensate and ensure that you speak the same language as your client or any other stakeholder? And so that's when you trigger their curiosity and they start to opening themselves to the idea, well, actually, it might be a smart idea to diversify, right?
Yeah.
And it doesn't necessarily mean that now I would go and hire someone without experience, but who is speaking more high context or low context, because that's the profile I need in my team. But it's something that I would take into consideration when thinking about how to diversify my team. That's number one. But number two is always about what is it that we are going to do with those differences. Because what I hear, and actually that's another common challenge that I experience in many teams, and that's there is misunderstanding of those two terms, diversity and inclusion. There is a misbelief that diversity and inclusion are the same thing. And the outcome of such misbelief is that you hear organizations talking about, oh, we are inclusive because we have this percentage of that kind of employees in our organization and that percentage of this kind of representation in our team. So we are inclusive. And I said, no, that means you are diverse. Now the question is, how do you approach those differences in your team? Because inclusion is only one way of managing differences. But the other way or other approaches to managing diversity is exclusion, it's assimilation, it's marginalization, it's integration or inclusion. So I would typically talk to teams and leaders about these approaches, analyzing them at deeper level, understanding how they really manifest in specific situation. And we talk about upsides, downsides of each of those approaches to managing diversity. And then I let them choose. So from what you said, which of those options are you going for and why? Why are you choosing inclusion, right? So you kind of internalize the conversation for them. So it's not you as an external observer, consultant, facilitator imposing an idea of inclusion on them, but it's them who make a conscious choice and informed decision. Why is inclusion for them the best approach how to manage the differences?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I have an interesting question from the audience that I'd like to ask you. Before I ask that question, though, I'd like to understand, you talked about you're certified in emotional intelligence. We know you're certified in cultural intelligence. Can you talk to us just a little bit about how both of those frameworks or those models help you as a consultant and can help leaders really bridge those differences, because we know that there is benefit to bringing diversity into the team. We also know there are KPIs that we have to hit. What tools are out there to help us facilitate effective inclusion, going beyond that diversity? Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Sure. We need to start using ourselves as the tools to achieve those KPIs. That's what we are talking about here today all the time, right? And so the connection between emotional intelligence and cultural intelligence is huge. You know, there's so much overlap. So when people work in diverse settings, they have emotional response to differences. And by differences, I mean any kind of difference. It could be generational differences, differences in sexual orientations, gender, race, ethnicity, and so on, but also differences in the way we behave. So here we go back to the conversation about cultural values, a difference in the way I manifest my emotions or don't manifest my emotions. We all emotionally respond to this kind of differences. Some of us will respond through emotions such as curiosity. Oh, that's new. I want to learn more. We feel joy when we are exposed to differences. We feel optimistic about those differences because we think they can help us to learn, to grow. But many other people, they feel skeptical about differences. They feel afraid, scared of differences. They feel frustrated or disappointed of differences, right? Because frustration and disappointment are two emotions that are very much connected to expectations. And when your expectations are not being met, you either feel frustrated or disappointed. The difference between frustration and disappointment as two emotions is in the impulse that this emotion is giving you, because emotions are giving you or they are trying to move you to certain actions. So when you feel frustrated, there is still hope that you can align the reality with your expectation. But when you feel disappointed, the impulse of this emotion is to disconnect.
Yeah.
If you think of the word disappointment, it's the opposite of appointment, right? So we appoint someone to certain job role, to certain position, because we expect them to achieve something. But when the expectation is not being met, we feel disappointed. So we have the tendency to disconnect from the person. So sometimes I feel that it's too early to jump into the conversation about cultural values if we don't address the topic of emotions and how people emotionally respond to differences, because only if we help them to understand their emotional response to differences, then they might know how to navigate their emotions in face of a difference. So yes, there is a very strong connection between those two frameworks, EQ and CQ.
Yeah. And, in a prior webinar, we talked about the differences and how those two models can interact with one another. And I really liked what one of our panelists said about, cultural intelligence helps us understand how to show up emotionally across various cultures, because as you shared earlier, when you were talking about emotional expressiveness and your colleague or your client who felt uncomfortable about the very neutral poker face, the inability of blinking, right? And so we need to understand that how we show up may differ depending on who we're showing up for. So we had a question, are we talking about emotional intelligence or cultural intelligence? We're talking about a bit of both. I want to go back to the question for a moment because I like, Andre, how you shared there are performance metrics, but also we need to understand behavioral metrics, right? So those of you who are asking about, can we see the chat? Will we save it? Will we share it? Absolutely. In addition to this recording, we will pull out the most important and relevant topics from the chat and share all of those with you. Andre, on this idea of behavior, we had a question come in that says this: regarding a focus on KPIs, do you have any experience with evaluating teams and or individuals by key behavioral indicators, KBIs? Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. I do have experience with few organizations where they put equal emphasis on what and how. That's how they call it. So they wouldn't call it or frame it as KPI versus KBIs, but they call it what and how. So what do you need to achieve as a team member or as a leader, but also how you are achieving it. And they would give 50-50 emphasis on both, right? So it's not enough for you to be a great achiever, but then you are a horrible colleague, horrible peer, horrible leader, and so on. Now, I do see a lot of challenges with these KBIs or key behavioral indicators because they are harder to be measured objectively, right? So that's the challenge. And that's one of the reasons why many organizations kind of still hesitate to go into those waters. But I always say that like denial is not really helping here. And instead of looking away from this very important aspect of evaluating someone's performance, let's expand our understanding of how to objectively measure those KPIs, right? So yes, definitely there are organizations who do focus on both aspects of someone's performance. And I very much support the idea, because I also agree that it's not only about what you do, but also how you do that. And we see so many examples in organizations, in business world, of those great achievers, great inspiring leaders who build great successful business organizations. But then we know what was behind it, that people were really humiliated in their organizations, and so on and so on. So we know those stories.
Yeah, that's great. I know we only have about 5 minutes left on our session. I will do one more question from the audience, and then we'll take time to announce the winner of the Culturally Intelligent Teams workshop. As a quick note, this workshop is very similar to what Andre has been talking about through this entire webinar, this idea of setting a foundation so we understand our individual team members, and then thinking about how do we pull out our common motivators? How do we strategize together with a common understanding, a common language? I would like to ask one more question of you, Andre. What resources are there for teams who want to address people first as their foundation? Can you talk about that?
Sure. Well, I'll probably start with workshops, right? Because that's where you can create a lot of impact on people if you create this learning space where people generate insight, right? Because it is the insight that has transformational power. If we send our people to workshops, trainings where they are being told what to do and how to do, it doesn't mean they will do that. That's not how we operate as humans. It needs to come from inside. So I would probably start with workshops or creating learning opportunities where it's all about self-reflection and group reflection, introspection, who we are, why we act the way we do, and so on. So that's how we can really generate insights. So workshops of this kind. And then there are many great tools, including, I mean, we are here at Cultural Intelligence Center, so I would highlight this cultural values mapping activity. I would mention some other resources that are available at Cultural Intelligence Center, such as cultural values cards, right? So those cultural values that we've been talking about here, I know there is a product called CV, or cultural values cards. And yeah, Kila, you are just sharing the picture of those cards. Great. Thank you for that. So this is another great and easy resource to be used for any team member or any leader, how to initiate a conversation about how similar or different we are in the team, and what do we do with those similarities or differences.
Yeah. Thank you, Andre. This discussion has been so rich, so enjoyable. I always enjoy spending time with you. The audience has been chatting all along and thanking you for your great insights. With these last minute or so, I am going to announce the winner of our workshop. For those of you who are able to join us, thank you for being here. We will share some of these resources, including the chat and the recording, and some information about the resources we discussed today. And so be on the lookout for that. We will be contacting you. So without further ado, why don't we announce the winner of the workshop? And by the way, when I announce the winner, if this individual has left the webinar, that's fine. We will be following up via email about next steps. So our winner today is Dawn Phillip from Rand Merchant Bank in South Africa. So congratulations, Dawn. We look forward to reaching out to you and working together to develop a workshop for you and your team. Thanks, everybody.
Congratulations. Thank you, everyone. Wish you all the best. Be safe. Bye.
Bye.